I want to first invite on Assal Rad. Assal, you are with the National Iranian American Council. You are PhD in Middle Eastern history. And I wanted to have you on because as I was on vacation, and I kind of feel bad saying that because people are fleeing war, but I had this scheduled. I was just like looking on my phone at some of the most racist uh, racist like reports from mainstream media. I don't even the sad part is they probably didn't even realize how racist what they were saying was. And then I started reading around, and obviously there is a stark contrast going on in the open arms for mostly majority white Ukrainian refugees in Poland and elsewhere, compared to Afghanistan refugees. We could go down the list: Syrian refugees, Somalian refugees. Before I get to you, I wanted to play the first clip, which I just was so disturbing to me. Colin, if we could play that.
I'm sorry. It's very emotional for me because I see European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed, children being killed every day with Putin's missiles and his helicopters and his rockets.
And so, of course, I understand and respect the emotion. What you were outlining there is this tension.
That was a top Ukrainian official highlighting that it's people with blonde hair and blue eyes that are having to flee. Colin, if we could also play the next one, which was a CBS reporter.
Now with the Russians marching in, it's changed the calculus entirely. Tens of thousands of people have tried to flee the city. There will be many more. People are hiding out in bomb shelters. But this isn't a place, with all due respect, like Iraq or Afghanistan, that has seen conflict raging for decades. This is a relatively civilized, relatively European, I have to choose those words carefully too, city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen. So it's partly human nature, but they are not in denial.
So let's start with the blonde hair and blue eyes comment. To me, whatever his intentions were, to me is obviously giving that nationality or race higher significance than other types of refugees.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen those clips over and over again, and I've seen so many more because there's just so many clips like that. I don't even know. It's hard to wrap your mind around the fact that so openly you hear just blatantly racist things. But no matter how many times I've seen it, every time I see it, I'm still a little bit shocked. Just because they're saying sort of what we've all been saying by we all, I mean, activists who have tried to point out racism, both domestically in the United States and global phenomenons of racism, how racism plays into our global war on terror, just our general foreign policy stance on so many issues. And now, because there's a sort of comparative issue, it's so blatant. And I mean, to try and I've made some comments and I've had people say things to me even before we saw this sort of slew of commentary. I remember making comments just initially because the initial reaction from the United States and Europe to the invasion of Ukraine compared to when those countries themselves invade countries, especially the United States, is just wildly different. And it shouldn't be. And one of the talking points that keeps getting thrown out is like, oh, that's whataboutism. Like, you can't talk about US invasions. You can't talk about how we've treated Muslim and Arab and other and African refugees. Of course you can. It's not whataboutism. It's consistency. It's pointing out hypocrisy because those very systems, those very notions of order don't work if they're not applied to everyone. And we're clearly not applying the same standards to everybody. The fact that you can hear, I mean, this is not a fringe narrative. This is not something you're hearing on some kind of far right extreme program. These are all mainstream media sources, and you're seeing it in multiple languages in multiple countries. And the ongoing theme is if you are blonde hair and blue eyed, if you're white, if you're European, somehow you are more deserving of sympathy and compassion. Now, let me be perfectly clear. Ukrainians are equally deserving of compassion and sympathy. But that's the problem is it's not that they're not getting it. It's that all of these other groups who have been suffering through war for decades have never gotten that kind of sympathy. And you keep hearing these Orientalist themes as if violence is inherent to, say, the Middle East, right? It's a region of violence, and it's completely devoid of the context of the violence that has been imposed on it by outside powers. For instance, in recent decades, the United States.
When he talks about, areas that have been in conflict for, decades and decades, they weren't just in conflict amongst themselves. That was a lot of that conflict was imposed by the United States, starting with, we could go all the way back to the first Gulf War, but Afghanistan, obviously, and then Iraq. So it's almost like he doesn't register that, like, not only do we not treat those refugees the same as how we have open arms for Ukrainians, but that refugee crisis in large part was created by the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so the language, though, it's not new for anyone who has, studied the history of colonialism. I mean, we are talking about language that is hundreds of years old. This is how slavery was justified. This is how genocide in the Americas was justified. This is how colonialism throughout Asia and Africa was justified. It was justified based on the fact that European civilization was superior, and that they were, taming or educating, savages or barbarians, or how this is actual language that was used to describe all of these peoples across the world. And so there's a certain point of irony when I see it, right? When I see a commentary that says, Europe is civilized, and and its offshoots, of course, and anything that is not Europe and its offshoots is considered uncivilized. I think about the number of conflicts that we've seen in Europe. Violence is inherent to the Middle East, and yet World War I and World War II were fought in Europe. Colonization of the entire Americas was done by Europeans. These genocidal campaigns were done by Europeans, and yet somehow that is completely outside of the analysis that makes one apparently naturally violent and the other one not violent, or its violence is considered benevolent. And that's the way that this is always framed. It's not the same kind of violence. That violence is savage. This violence is to help.
Right.
And so that's how we always frame these types of conflicts. And how it was framed when the United States, for instance, when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003, it wasn't an accident that President Bush at the time used phrases like a crusade to describe it, right? These are very historical beliefs that are so ingrained in our psyche. And in our psyche, I mean by in the psyche of white Europeans and white Americans, that we can't even see how racist it is. That's the interest. That's why I'm saying, the fact that this is a completely mainstream. You notice in those clips, it's not just that they're saying it; it's that no one is pushing back.
Yeah.
Right. There's other human beings sitting there that could be like, "Are you sure you're being careful about your language?" But no one pushes back. It's just so accepted because these ideas are so ingrained, and that's why it's so important to talk about the issue of racism, Orientalism, othering all of these groups in the way that we discuss foreign policy.
Right. And I also think there's another element here, and that is brazen verbal racism. I bring up President Trump proposing Muslim bans. Obviously, he did not want refugees coming here. All the anti-immigrant fervor and rhetoric, the wall, all those things. I mean, he wasn't really hiding it. It was not a dog whistle. It was a siren. But so people like Joe Biden, the Democratic Party, very few Republicans, they would very loudly criticize that and speak up for refugees, this and that. So when you have that very clear racism from Trump that the quote unquote resistance is going after, but then Trump is gone and the resistance is basically signaling that kind of racism, only without being so obvious, meaning we need, the double standards that we're speaking of. Can you kind of talk about, all these liberals rightly criticize Trump, but I don't think they realize they're kind of low key advocating not as brazen like a Muslim ban, but certainly not being consistent with the humanitarian aid for brown and black people versus white people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, our politics have become polarized, and we have so many examples of that. But it's become so extreme that, to your point, if Trump does something or did something, you had a certain amount of backlash from centrists, from leftists, from liberals, from Democrats. And now, even if President Biden has the exact same policy. It's not treated the same way. So it's not a policy position that's being criticized. It's, you know, as long as it's not my party doing it, then it's fine. And that's completely inconsistent with a value-based system, right? I mean, you can say that if basically it has nothing to do with values, but we use those talking points when it's our opposition that's in power. And so it makes them completely meaningless. I mean, if you look at the Biden administration, you had a decision a few weeks ago that after freezing the assets that belong to the Central Bank of Afghanistan, which is creating basically an economic collapse in Afghanistan, where 23 million people are facing starvation. 23 million people in Afghanistan face starvation. What did the Biden administration also decide to do? To steal half of it and frame it in all sorts of ways as, no, this is about, you know, legal cases in the United States. I don't understand how domestic U.S. law can justify something that is stealing from another country, right? That doesn't work. You have to use international law when you're talking about something that's not just about our own country. And there's it's crickets. There's almost no backlash towards this fact. But all of a sudden, we have this humanitarian outcry about Ukraine. And again, we should, because it is an invasion. You have 1 million people who have already fled the country, but in part, the reason why 1 million people have fled the country is because they had the ability to do so, right? It's not that there weren't that many refugees in other cases, it's that they didn't have the ability to so quickly be able to flee from their own borders. They've been stopped at every sort of border so that they would not be able to cross. So the disparity is both, to your point, in the sort of racialized way that it is, but also politically and domestically in the United States, it's treated completely differently under the Biden administration. And that's, you know, I mean, that flies in the face of anything that liberals use, Democrats used to criticize President Trump. And, you know, that'll come back as a sort of, you know, those types of criticisms will come back to haunt us later because they will be used as talking points against whoever the Democratic president is, whoever the candidates are. All of those things will then be used as talking points against that party as well.
Thanks for watching, and make sure to tune in to Status Coup's daily live stream Monday through Thursday at 5 o'clock Eastern Time and Fridays at 4 o'clock Eastern Time.